Cyberpunk multiplayer would be your dream since it would allow you to combine your knowledge with your personality. We just don't know when it'll actually release. Yeah, so Cyberpunk multiplayer is going to be probably the most saturated game, multiplayer game at launch ever. So if you're ready to compete against the most saturated game ever, go for it. You or me, asshole. I would say I would caution against that. I mean, it might be a game, it's going to be a game that you're probably going to play regardless, me too. But Cyberpunk multiplayer, like look how many times the main Cyberpunk 2077 game was delayed. Do you think that Cyberpunk multiplayer is going to be coming out on time? Overwatch. Come on. I mean, the main Cyberpunk multiplayer game is going to be like 2023, maybe. Reloading. Maybe 2024. I mean, they're going to wait forever to release that game. They're going to make sure that it's perfect before they release it. And you know that. So I wouldn't even be thinking about Cyberpunk 2077 multiplayer right now. I just don't think it's a relevant game and it just doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. And you know what I'm saying? So I wouldn't be waiting. Like if a game doesn't have like any sort of release date announced, then I would be really careful even thinking about it, to be honest. I mean, we all want Cyberpunk 2077 multiplayer to come out, but yeah. That's way too far in the future. So if you wanted to make, like, let's say hype content for Cyberpunk 2077 multiplayer, that is viable. If you want to position yourself as the channel, I mean, nobody's doing this yet. If you want to position yourself as the YouTube channel that's looking forward to Cyberpunk 2077 multiplayer, then that could be really, really interesting. And you could do videos of like, you know, top things we want and top things we, you know, yabbity yabbity ya and all that stuff. And that type of content could end up doing really well potentially. So I would say Craze World, you love creating educational content for shooters like guides, tips, etc. Look, dude, take my idea and run with it. If Cyberpunk 2077 ends up being half as good as we all hope, let's say, right? If you end up positioning yourself today as the authority on that game, you could end up making content for maybe one of the biggest multiplayer games of all time, and you do hype content and news and coverage specifically for that game. 10 things we want, 10 things we would love from the single player game that could be a multiplayer. You could do, you know, what racing might be like in the game. You could do something like, you know, what the best guns would be in multiplayer, things like that. You could take stuff that you're seeing in the single player game of Cyberpunk 2077, and you could use that potentially as, you know, as ammo, if you will, to make content and speculate about what the multiplayer version of the game will be like. It's just, it's an idea. It is a possibility. I'm not saying that it's necessarily the best possible strategy, but I am saying that it could work. Somebody is going to be the authority on Cyberpunk 2077. So the question is it going to be you? There's always going to be the channel for whatever the next big game is, right? Is it going to be you? And the early bird gets the worm with that kind of stuff. That's another thing I'd say about it. The early bird gets the worm.
Wilco.
And so a channel like Neon Arcade, for example, started, I mention them all the time because they're just the latest version of somebody who made a channel about an upcoming game. They started doing news for Cyberpunk 2077 before most of the other people out there, right? And they've been covering the news for that game more consistently than almost everybody out there. And so now when they live stream, like I mentioned, they're getting, you know, insane amounts of viewers. You know, 1,000 plus, and they're not even a live stream channel. They get like 1,000 plus viewers, and that's freaking amazing.